All right, good evening, everybody. So welcome to vBrownBag. We are on the EMEA channel, and we are continuing our VCAP6-DCV Design series this week. And we have two presenters with us, both are VCDX. We've got Jason and Ron. So I will let them introduce themselves in just 1 second. Technical difficulties. There we go. Slide didn't want to change. So there we go. See, the ice is broken. I already messed up PowerPoint. You guys are going to be golden for the rest of the episode. So make sure, if you are watching live, that you join in on the conversation. Feel free to ask questions via the GoToWebinar or via Twitter, and I'll be monitoring that. So you can use the @vBrownBag handle or @vBrownBag EMEA, as well as #vBrownBag. So we will be continuing this series every Tuesday on the EMEA channel until we are finished. So we only have a few episodes left. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Jason and Ron for a second and let them introduce themselves. By the way, I'm Rebecca. I'm going to be your host this evening. I should have said that at the very beginning, but that did not happen either. So Jason, go ahead.
Sure. So my name is Jason Grierson. I'm VCDX206. My Gmail account is below, along with my Twitter handle. I'm also the one that wrote the simulator, or I run virtualtears.net. I also contribute to vMusketeers a little bit. And fun fact, I was the guy that walked into the defense after Ron. So with that, we'll segue into Ron.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ron Wedel. I'm VCDX227. I am infrastructure architect at a actual VMware customer here in Chicago. So I get to exercise some infrastructure architecture skills from a customer perspective most days. And you have my Twitter handle there, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Right. And unfortunately for Ron and Jason, I'm also a VCDX number 243, so I'm going to be harassing them for the next hour. So, all right.
Someone has to keep us on.
Exactly. I would expect the same from you guys. So I'm going to go ahead and make Jason the presenter here. There we go. So whenever you're ready, feel free to take it over.
Perfect. Can you see my screen, or?
Yes.
Yep, we're good to go.
Okay,
so as we said before, Ron Wedel, Jason Grierson, there's our contact information. We'll be covering Objective 2.4 on the VCAP6-DCV Design Blueprint, which is building our manageability requirements into a vSphere logical design. So for our agenda here, Jason and I are going to go through the bullet points from the blueprint, but to start that off, we're going to kind of do a quick review of design qualities. As such, since they are so important to both the VCAP-DCV design exam and as well when you graduate up into a VCDX level defense. It's a key part of both exams, and so we'll take a little bit of time to review those qualities. And then I'm not going to read them off here, but we're going to hit each of these bullet points at least at a high level to provide some insight on how they may apply to either the DCV VCAP exam or a VCDX defense.
Perfect.
So as I said before, the design qualities that covered here, availability, manageability, performance, recoverability, and security, are key to both the VCAP design exam and a VCDX level defense. The quality that we're most going to be focused on tonight is going to be manageability, kind of bolded there. But all of these design qualities interact with each other, and you have to find balance, whether it is with manageability versus performance or recoverability or security. And you tease those out when you build that conceptual model and you work with your customer and you find which one of the design qualities is going to be most important to them. And then you try to balance against all the other requirements and constraints that may come up.
Yeah, and this is a very important part both for the design exam and the VCDX process, because these are areas they're going to score you on and like quiz you on and attack you on a lot in those two processes. These are incredibly important in the VCDX, and you'll see a handful of questions revolved around these pillars on the DCD or the design exam as well. So getting into it, what we wanted to kind of do is kind of set the tempo with this presentation around how the exam is going to look and how this chapter is actually going to tie into the DCD or the VCAP-DCV. I apologize if I say DCD. It's just the format that I've been used to talking about for so long. So one of the things when I first went down my DCD or VCAP-DCV journey was when I read this chapter, I kind of read it over and looked at it. I'm like, okay, it's management, it's change control, it's that sort of stuff. How are they physically going to quiz me on this? What can they quiz me on? So we get a lot of questions and a lot of those things. So for instance, the blueprint does a really great job of giving you the keys to the kingdom, but they don't really tell you where to look in the kingdom. So we want to just kind of drill down and hyper focus not only on the VCDX journey that you may take after this and how this chapter is important to that, but also how it ties into the exam specifically. So with that said, when you look at the title, build manageability requirements into the vSphere 6.0 logical design, the key word in here is requirements. They're really going to be looking for you to extrapolate out of this chapter is how to pull the manageability requirements out of a customer or question and how to look at those and what to do with them. And from a tool sets point of view, these are kind of like the tools that you're going to see these kind of scattered throughout the presentation. And we're going to double back to this because you're going to see like these are the things they can quiz you on. So if they say we want to streamline management or we want to make deployment quicker, these are all management requirements and tools we can use to help improve them or build into the design or design around. Any additional comments there, Ron? Or
no, I think you hit it right on the head. These are some of the tools that they offer us. And we're not going to go deep dive into what those tools do. It's the tools that are in the tool set that they want you to be aware of and how they can affect those requirements in your design itself.
Perfect. So yeah, kind of segueing into that. These are typical questions I get when people are challenging the VCAP design exam is, how do I score points? What will I be quizzed on in 2.4? How do I study for this section? So realistically, since the exam is only drag and drop and a design canvas now, you're going to be quizzed on this section in one of those two ways. And more than likely, it's going to be revolved around the pillars and extrapolating requirements out of them. So like this example on the bottom left here, you have a scenario where they want you to categorize some requirements based off availability, manageability, performance, recoverability, and security. So this is, this is what we were talking about in the last slide. There is using those tools and pulling out the requirements and being able to categorize them into the pillars and those sorts of things. An example on the design canvas where manageability and being able to extrapolate those requirements would come in would be something with a constraint of, the customer only has standard or enterprise, not enterprise plus. Go configure a networking diagram, right? So you can't use the VDS at that point. And this can sometimes have a domino effect into the design because you might be supplying a requirement that is needed, but that could also add constraints or change the design in a way that affects other pillars as well. Anything you want to jump on there, Ron, before we jump into your
and so in relation to the exam and those characteristics in the drag and drop, it's also good to know that, sometimes things do fall into more than one category, right? Something may be both availability and manageability or performance and recoverability. So being able to understand what those pillars mean and how they may tie back to those customer requirements, I feel is one of the key things that we're going to be scored on this exam.
Perfect. So with that, we'll jump right into the bullet points and the agenda, which is actually breaking down the sections of 2.4. Yeah. So I believe I think we each have 6 points or somewhere along there. So
yeah, so I'll take the first 6 here, and then we're going to get into the last 6 with Jason. So looking at the bullet points from the exam blueprint from VMware, the first one that it had listed was evaluating management services that can be used in a given vSphere solution. And so I was kind of torn on how to approach this for everyone, but I figured we could start with a VCDX example. You know, here's a handful of requirements that were gathered from a customer. We want to reduce admin overhead. We have multiple data centers, but then we have a constraint with licensing. So how are we going to evaluate which management services we can put into the design itself? So based on our constraint of our licensing, we're able to pick and choose a fair amount of those technologies that they want to cover in terms of vCenter or the VDS or host profiles, which will all help reduce the admin overhead. And then on the right, I wanted to just highlight a design from the validated design reference architecture that kind of shows, you know, how you would even take that to the next level in terms of a design to encompassing all data centers, you know, showing manageability because we have a single sign-on domain that is shared across all the data centers, which would reduce that management overhead for the customer by allowing them to, you know, share licenses, have a single place to handle authentication across the entire board. So really, here again, it goes back to trying to evaluate based on customer requirements, you know, what you're going to use in your design to meet those manageability requirements. You know, are you going to have linked mode vCenter? Are you going to have a cluster database to back it up? You have to take all of those into consideration and still come back to the requirements listed to meet your customer requirements, but ensure that you're meeting that manageability design quality. So, and then, so going into the next point, the differentiating infrastructure qualities related to management, what this really comes down to is trying to find a balance in your design, you know, looking at all the the pillars in terms of availability, manageability, performance, security, and making sure that you're finding a balance with your solutions. If we were strictly concerned with manageability, you know, we could do a single vCenter with a single data store and perhaps password policies controlled by the platform services controller, and again, another single data store. But when you look holistically at your design and the other design qualities, you have to find a balance. Your single data store might not be there to provide you enough performance to meet your other requirements, or, you know, it may be such a large data store that you can't recover it if there was an outage in your published RTO. So you always have to be going through the circle, or, you know, this diagram Jason put together, all the design qualities, and tying them back and trying to find a good balance. And you get that balance, you get the priority for that balance from your customer, from that conceptual model that you built with them, going through their requirements and their constraints and that interaction with the customer to find what's the most important. You know, if they're extremely understaffed and operationally poor, manageability may win out over security or availability, depending on what that customer is pushing for. So when you want to differentiate those qualities, you know, in related to management, you got to find a balance. And that's going back and, you know, continuously going through that design methodology after you build your logical and physical models, going back to the customer and refining constantly throughout the process.
Yeah, I think one of the two that constantly fight with each other is manageability and security. Those that's like a double-edged sword, because the more you lock stuff down with security, the harder it is to manage, right? So
exactly, you have a lot more details to manage there. You know, the example I put up, the simple password policy. You know, so your security for the customer may require you to be changing the SQL Service account if you're using a Windows vCenter every 90 days. So how do you manage that? You know, that becomes a management nightmare, and that's when you start to reach out and figure out maybe a scripted solution to balance out the manageability because they have less staff, but to meet that security concern.
perfect.
So, not a lot on this slide, unfortunately. Differentiate available command line based management tools. Really, for the DCD exam, you know, I think this is more just about understanding that there's, you know, the three big ones: PowerCLI, VCLI, and VMA available to you, and what they do. You know, the PowerShell commandlets allows you to manage your vSphere environment with the PowerShell interface. But at the same time, it also has ESXi commands, so that kind of overlaps with the VCLI. And then the VMA kind of, again, has some VCLI interface qualities, but as well as, the syslog server and some other scripting tools available. So in relation to the DCD exam, just understanding what these tools do and how they relate to you. And then in terms of your VCDX journey, it's always looking at these tools and putting them in a design where you're going to be meeting a customer requirement. Sometimes, if you're constrained from licensing and you're not able to leverage, VROPs or some of the more advanced tools, you can always come back and leverage PowerShell to meet those customer requirements, or VCLI or VMA. It's all about understanding what's available and what meets your requirement.
And this is a trend you're going to see with this particular chapter with the design exam. Is the design exam, there is a lot, it talks about management a lot, and there will be stuff that quizzes you in there, but it might not be weighted quite as heavily as some of the other chapters. So what they're really doing in this chapter is laying the groundwork for the proper design methodology to teach you how to ask the right questions. And then if you decide to pursue your VCDX, that's where more of this stuff will kind of come in as well.
Yeah, it's the management tools. It's not really a tech-heavy chapter, but it's definitely a bigger picture, business-driven chapter.
For sure.
So again, let's evaluate customer solutions. Here's the VCDX example was changed from a couple of slides ago. So the customer now only has enterprise licensing, and we still want to reduce our admin overhead. So what solutions can we use? Understanding that without Enterprise Plus, we've just lost VDS. Without vSphere with operations management, we've lost VROPs. And how's that going to impact our customer design? What can we leverage? What tools are available to us? So again, the vCenter DRSHA, we're not going to go deep into those technologies, but being able to understand kind of the limits that come with that constraint and evaluating those solutions. And then when we tie that back to, like Jason showed in his example with the drag and drop, understanding, what solutions are going to be available if you get asked a question of, hey, we want to increase manageability, what technologies can we use to do that? And that's what we're going to come and list here. But the customer has a constraint of only enterprise, so you got to make sure that you're not putting stuff in that sounds great, and if we all had a free budget, we would always design the most advanced, awesome solution, but in reality, that's not how it works out. So again, like Jason said, this is kind of a higher, less technical section. Yeah, so building interfaces to the logical design for existing operations. And really what we need to do here is take a look at an existing customer's existing infrastructure and tie that back into our virtual design, So, we have to take into consideration Active Directory. What's the customer's password policy? Are we going to be adding our ESX host to Active Directory for, management, for access to them? Does the customer have some type of syslog already stood up? Do they have requirements based on governance that says you have to leverage that syslog and rotate and keep X amount of days? And also, a big part of management is tying it into change management. So is there a CMDB? How do we tie the virtual infrastructure into that CMDB, leveraging vCenter tags, change control when you add a host to the infrastructure? What does that look like? You got to take all of that in consideration when designing for manageability. It's not all about just the virtual infrastructure. We have to take a holistic approach to the entire infrastructure and tie in existing solutions that the customer may have. When we talk about manageability in this regard, if say we had a customer wanting to reduce management overhead, how, does that include our maintenance window? Do we have a big enough maintenance window to do all of our patching in how we've designed our infrastructure? We have to take into consideration all of that before we go forward.
Yeah, and not so much to the design exam, but in the VCDX track as well. You know, when you get your defense and stuff, like they could ask you questions like, you know, where's your syslog? How's it backed up? You know, what if that breaks? Things of that nature. And, you know, that all kind of wraps up into that management silo and that management bubble. It's kind of funny how quickly you can run down the rabbit hole on that.
Very much so. And, you know, when we're talking about design qualities, syslog's another one of those that can rolls over into security. You know, what's the security posture? How many logs do we have to keep? How often is your ESX host rotating logs? Is it an extremely busy host? Is there something wrong where you're rolling through a couple of gig a day and only capturing 12 hours? Those are all types of things you have to take in consideration, especially like Jason said, from the VCDX design perspective, is looking, you know, taking a step back from just, you know, all virtual infrastructure and understanding what that customer needs to fit into their existing practices.
Yeah, I think this slide's like a perfect example of what you're talking about earlier, of how many times our design qualities are interdependent, right? So you mentioned, like, for example, the syslog and security, but you could also argue, you know, monitoring of the hardware, you know, and even SNMP could potentially be availability related.
Correct. You know, maintenance window, that could be performance related when you start thinking about, well, how many hosts can I patch at a time and still meet my performance operating level agreement that has been set with the customer? Is it one host, two hosts? Does that even apply during a maintenance window? So you got to take those into consideration when you design it.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, if you have a customer who's 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, then you know what, maybe we can get away with taking 3 hosts out of a 6 host cluster during maintenance. Maybe we can't. You know, you got to take those holistically into consideration. It's not just management wanting to plow through your updates. It's also performance for the applications and services that are running in your virtual infrastructure.
Yeah, another example of that would be if you have N+2. So with N+2, you're like, okay, I can take 2 hosts down for maintenance purposes, which is great. But when you have those 2 hosts down, is there going to be any problems? What if a host fails? Can you still fulfill your SLAs? Are you going to take a performance hit if one host fails when you bring 2 down for maintenance? You no longer are sustaining your N+2, those sorts of questions. So it definitely can fan out really quickly.
Yeah. And those are all valid things to be quizzed on, in especially the VCDX defense, is making sure as a, you know, design expert, not just the virtual infrastructure, being able to step back and understand the entire picture that the customer is presenting to you, and making sure that you're not, you know, forsaking management by putting in this great product that's super, super complicated to manage, but still won't meet their performance requirement during a maintenance window or something along those lines. Now, this one, addressing identified operational readiness deficiencies. There's not much I feel like I can speak to as an expert on this slide in particular, because if you were to go to the reference located at the bottom of the page, and the slide deck will be up on Jason's blog post this, or you can, if you're watching on YouTube, pause it and type it out. VMware has put in, this is really the marriage between your virtual infrastructure and following some ITIL guidelines in terms of filling out a quiz and understanding where you are from an operational readiness, where you want to be, and then it shows you what the industry average is as well. It's a great tool to be able to highlight, you know, where you may be deficient in a design. You know, oh wow, we filled it out. We're really, really poor on, say, problem ops. Well, why is that? Well, according to this, you know, when you look at it, does your tier 3 all have VCP level certifications? Is there enough knowledge at a tier 3? Where based on a customer, that may not be a concern, but this helps highlight some of and helps you gather those requirements for the design.
Yeah, you can kind of look at this as a roadmap. Like VMware has really good roadmap images if you want to get to the full, like, private cloud or hybrid private cloud with the full automation suite, right? But you're not going to, as a new customer, you're not going to just go from 0 to 100. It's going to be a crawl, walk, run kind of mentality. in most cases. You're going to stand up the infrastructure, go on a journey a little bit further next budget cycle and further and further. From a management aspect or a change management or ITIL, this is kind of like their roadmap of if you're here, here's how you get to here. And from a design perspective, this is where you could add in extra pieces from the manageability silo to try and help a customer possibly get there if that was a requirement, or they might not even know it's a requirement until you discuss it with them.
Mm-hmm. And this is also goes back to, some of the first sections for the VCAP DCD, building that conceptual model, building out requirements and constraints, making some assumptions and highlighting risks. This is another great tool that VMware provides you to be able to sit with the customer as you work through a design to find areas where the customer may be deficient and try to, put some requirements around, resolving those issues. And if you can't, those can be risks, and it's a great way to highlight the risks to the customer and say, hey, look, we're putting in VRO or VROPS and your staff has zero experience with it. It's a risk that we need to highlight, and this tool can help highlight those issues and help you have that conversation with your customer to be able to understand where they're at and where they need to be.
Perfect. So moving on, which is a perfect segue into ITIL and change management. So when Ron talked to me about jumping into this conversation, I'm like, sure, buddy, no problem. And then I looked on the chapters I had. I'm like, what have I done to you?
Yeah, I felt really bad because I was, as someone who's come from an operations background, I find management and manageability to be very near and dear to my heart. And then when we started digging in, it was a whole bunch of ITIL.
So my slides are going to be a little bit dry, but what we're going to do is we're going to go over the design methodology around change control, ITIL management, those sorts of things. So that slide, that roadmap from an ITIL or change management perspective, we're going to go over some of those keys and some of the key points in it, and I'll also talk about how it's going to tie back to the exam. So with that in mind, I hate doing this in presentations because I'm a strong believer that you should never just read bullet for bullet for bullet on a presentation slide. So I've tried to minimize that as much as possible here, but I want to just drive out some key points here because they are very important to these specific design methodologies. So an event is a change of a state which might have an influence of the management of a service or system. So everyone kind of, if they've ever ran, vCenter or any other management tool, events pop up a lot of times. They're typically not too concerning. When they tend to get concerning is when an incident happens, which is an event which is not part of a standard operation. It might cause a service disruption or reduce productivity. So we've all seen those. Someone's pulled a switch down or done something silly or a bug or glitch, something breaks, and it's causing an impact to the business. A problem is one that is the cause of one or more incidents. The problems are usually identified because of multiple incidents. So you keep getting this, users can't get to the file server, users can't get to the file server. And then so what will happen from a change management perspective is you will create a problem ticket and link in or copy those notes, but you won't take an incident and turn it into a problem. But now that's not to say that an incident can't give you evidence on how to fix the problem. That will still be handled by your help desk, but this is all part of the change management control. And when you're doing your conceptual design or your discovery with a customer, if they do have a change management manager or staff in-house, definitely when you're talking to them, they would be a subject matter expert you'd want to talk about from a management perspective. You'd want to have them in the room for sure because they know this stuff cold.
And also, to Jason's point, on that slide at the very bottom, SLA ? It's very easy in a VCDX design. I've gathered my customer requirements. We require 99.9% uptime, and our design meets that. But at the same time, you still have to work with your customer to figure out a way to measure that. And I feel like this in particular is, that event, incident, problem management talks to being able to measure if you're meeting the SLA.
Yeah, 100%. Because, and this is a very good question. If you go to a customer and you say, what kind of uptime do you want? They're like, I want 99% or whatever the number is they give you. And you say, okay, no problem. What was your uptime last year? A lot of people struggle with ways of measuring this or measuring their service level agreements for their users or customers. So like Ron said, this is exactly what change management is for. It is a way of measuring an SLA, and different units in the business can have different SLAs as well. So you could have a publicly facing cloud or app or something that could have a much more stringent SLA opposed to like the poor dev guys down a couple cubicles over. So 100%, it's definitely a way of tracking and assuring an SLA so that you can go back to the business and say, yeah, we're meeting the numbers that you've set forth for us. Analyze release management practices. So essentially, there's a lot of information around this. At the end of the presentation, I have some references where I pulled this from. It's part of the blueprint. There is a long ITIL version 3 PDF VMware does publish. That's where most of this is pulled from, along with what a blog I used to study for the DCD last time I wrote it. But the important part here is, so the release and deployment management is the effective release and deployment delivers significant business value by delivering changes at optimized speed, risk, and cost, and offering a consistent, appropriate, and auditable implementation of usable and useful business services. So what this really kind of translates to is define the process that can get a service into production or a request into production. So if you look at the ITIL kind of flowchart here, you can see where the release management comes in the middle there. And what this means is, from a business perspective, is if I have a service that I need to get into production or a request, how do I do it? And what you're going to be looking for from a design perspective or for the exams perspective is, how can I make it more optimized, cost efficient, low risk, consistent, audible, and usable, and easier to consume by the business. So things that we have from a VMware's perspective that can help us to achieve this is VMware templates, snapshots, the VMA with scripting, vSphere Orchestrator or vRealize Orchestrator, or the vRealize suite in general. So the more ways you have of quickly being able to do that will help achieve that. With that, we roll into the determine, request, fulfillment, and release management process. So, I hate reading from this, but the request fulfillment process is a service request, is a request from a user for information or advice, or for a standard change, or for access to an IT service. In short, enable users to request and receive standard services. So if we look at the middle here, we have the flow chart. We have a user makes a request, usually through some form of a help desk call, whatever it may be. They come and tap you on the shoulder at your desk, or and sometimes line up at your desk. There's an approval process, and then there's a request fulfillment. So you actually go and do what the request is, and then you close the ticket from a change management perspective. So how can we actually help with this from a design aspect from within VMware? Is we can assign roles within the VMware environment or tool sets, 2 roles in the organization that can fulfill these these requests. So an example of this would be vSphere permissions of virtual center infrastructure. So we could give the help desk maybe the ability to spin up VMs or reset VMs or do, add a NIC or add, attach the CD-ROM drive or something of that nature. It could be templates to help, do a fulfillment. Those templates could also be linked to a self-service portal or a script or some kind of flow inside vSphere Orchestrator or vRealize Orchestrator. And these could all be things that could help fulfill those requests. And there's lots of different ways to achieve that. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone manually doing the steps or pushing a button. I've actually seen in some service programs like ServiceNow and I forget what the other large one is, where they actually have it linked with APIs, where once a request is actually approved, it goes into Orchestrator and it kicks off a flow, and it all goes and does its thing, and there's less administrative overhead that way, especially for simple tasks and those sorts of things. So I've actually seen some neat implementations of that as well.
Yeah. And going back maybe, to the VCDX perspective, again, it's trying to leverage all of those tools in a way that fits the customer's requirements while still taking, at least in this, what we're talking about tonight, manageability into perspective. All of that, all those scripts are great, and it may fit the budgetary constraint you may have, but at the same time, you have to balance that against, if I'm providing the script, does the staff have knowledge to maintain the script? If there's problems with the script, what happens?
Yeah, for sure. And then like you said, especially from a VCDX standpoint, it's really laying the groundwork, and those are things that you have to pull out and design around or call out for sure. So determine requirements for configuration management. Ron actually touched on this a little bit earlier as well with a configuration management database. So change management, in short, is the purpose of change. The purpose of change management process is to ensure that standardization methods are used for the efficient and prompt handling of all changes. And this typically usually has a configuration management system tied with it. Why is standardization methods important? It's to reduce errors, it's to keep things consistent, and to reduce the administrative overhead. So keynotes.
So would you say to make an environment more manageable?
Yeah, manageable. Yeah, for sure, 100%. And again, this goes back to ITIL or any kind of change management process, and I've seen it from very little to the full ITIL kind of implementation. And again, definitely 100% to make it more manageable. And another good kind of design aspect around this too is, let's say for instance you had a customer requirement or constraint that said, well, we need to streamline the change management control. The virtualization change management is too long. We have to get approvals from the storage team, the network team, the server team, the Wintel team, and then the VMware team to, before we can make a change to like add a data store or something like that, which is crazy, right? And that could take sometimes 3 weeks before everyone makes the approval. So, maybe that drives your design towards, a hyper-converged environment like a SimpliVity or Nutanix or a Cisco HyperFlex, something like that, where everything is under one team's roof, so that the change control only maybe has to go past 1 or 2 people, opposed to 3 or 4 different groups. So keynotes, like Ron was saying for change management here, is the process to control change and the tools at our disposal from a VMware and the design exams perspective that they can ask you on is vRealize Configuration Manager. And then you can
vRealize Orchestrator.
Yeah, Orchestrator, those sorts of things. So you're going to see a lot of the same tools show up over and over and over again. And like Ron said, like the purpose of this chapter isn't to dive into those tools on a very technical level, but it's to realize what they can do and how they can fulfill requirements from a management perspective or capability. Another thing we can do from our tools is we can create change control roles to align with the change policies. So an example of this is, say you had a golden template that was part of an orchestration flow, or even just something that your team deploys. You could set only certain people can make changes to those templates, right? To help adhere to that standardization, things of that nature. The next part that the 2.4 chapter, as far as change control, hits on a lot is the service asset in the configuration management aspect, or the SACM. And long and short of this whole chapter, or the long and short of this paragraph is, this is the asset management of IT and non-IT business assets. And the reason why this comes up is definitely you want to track that. Sometimes this can be anything from naming conventions to tracking certain items in your organization, iPads, desktops, VDIs, servers, but it really kind of bleeds into the life cycle as well, so that the service life cycle of that product. Oops. So a good example of this, again, in the VCDX track is talking about okay, well, you talked about a lot about how, or they could ask you questions about how do you deploy systems, like, so you made this wonderful design, and when you give the keys to the kingdom to the customer and say, here, run with this, what can they follow to deploy? And when the time does come as for decommission, it's like, oh, what's the decommission process involved in that as well from a life cycles perspective?
Yeah, so and from a VCDX perspective, again, the lifecycle management is another, I feel, a big thing that gets overlooked. Everyone says, well, I've designed this, six host cluster and it's great and everything's awesome, but did we talk about what happens when we need to add a host for growth? Did we talk about what happens when we decommission a server because it's out of support? Did we talk about what happens when we add another host that was bought 3 years later? Did you enable EVC in your design? So, service lifecycle management are key things to always be thinking about. And I feel each section, when you go past this into a VCDX design, that lifecycle management portion of compute, storage, how are you adding, how are you decommissioning? Are you setting standards on server names, IP addressing, things that all of those can help reduce the management overhead of an environment, while standardizing the ability to grow further.
Yeah, 100%. And we talk a lot about the VCDX in this chapter just because it is setting a lot of the groundwork for that. But we, in the end, we'll conclude too and kind of give you a Coles Notes version of how to tie this all together and what to really focus on, because some of it does tie back, or a lot of it does tie back to the exam. But this is another chapter where, like Ron said, there's a lot of use cases when going through that design methodology. So getting to exactly that, based on customer requirements, identify required reporting assets and processes. So again, we kind of talked a lot about this, and Ron just reiterated some of that is, determining monitoring requirements, determining change control requirements, determining SLA for the infrastructure, determine what assets need to be tracked and monitored, determine how newly deployed VMs will stay consistent or be deployed effectively. If this is a consulting engagement, when you give the project over, how will you maintain the infrastructure? How are you going to scale it out, scale it up? How the life cycle process? How is that going to be done for when you're gone? And definitely the documentation. The documentation is so critical, especially in a consulting engagement. Not only to defend your design decisions, but also it's very common for me. I hand the customer, I go, here, Mr. Customer, here's the keys. Your new infrastructure. Have fun. Here's a big pile of documentation of everything that we've done, the design decisions around because of your requirements, constraints, and risks, and all those sorts of things. And then 3 years later, they come back to me and they go, well, why did this happen? We're having a bottleneck here, and yada yada. And I go, well, yeah, that was because of this requirement or this constraint, and this was the design decision, and these were the options that were provided, and this is the one you selected. So it's not only to help yourself and the customer, but it's also to defend your design decisions, and then make sure everyone's on the same page in agreement about kind of what's going in. So
and again, you had a great point. We keep bringing up going to the VCDX, defending those design decisions, tying things back to requirements and understanding your justifications for why you did something.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's such a critical part of the VCDX process, for sure. Yeah. I guess in conclusion, the last thing we'll talk about as well. So if from the VCD or the VCAP-DCV design exams perspective, there's a lot of groundwork and a lot of design methodology here, especially if you're new to design. That is very important, but from a like a Coles Notes version or narrowing it down, just focus, like if you had to say, well, if I have short time, what can I study for in this chapter? Focus on the management tools that we showed at the beginning there. And because those are the ones that are going to help you fulfill your requirements, and practice, utilizing those. Like how would I fill requirements, and how would I design around management, requirements and or constraints. That's what the exam is going to ask you on, and those sorts of things. And we kind of talked about that a little bit earlier around the drag and drop examples and or the design canvas.
Yeah, being able to classify those requirements into the ampers or ramps, or however you want to remember it, the design qualities, the availability, manageability, performance, recoverability, and security. Being able to classify your requirements and constraints into one of those buckets. I feel like that was a great tool for me that helped me pass the first time I took my DCD, is as an exercise, writing out, thinking up even just random requirements that a customer may have, and say, okay, so what buckets does this fit into? Does it fit into manageability? Does it fit into recoverability, security, whatever it may be? Especially for this section on the DCD exam. Again, like I feel like very few things in this section where you're going to be dropped into the Canvas portion, but you're going to be doing lots of drag and drop bucketing. So yes. Understanding how a requirement or a constraint can be classified, and that also, graduates up into the VCDX defense, is being able to classify what those requirements or constraints go into, and being able to justify your decisions based on a design quality. I did X because I wanted to maintain manageability because of requirement 7. Mm-hmm. Being able to walk through that, and it's a great exercise, and the DCD, I think, really helps you prepare and jump into that level.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. So with that said, the last slide in the deck here is just the references that we use. So these are the references from both me and Ron. Some of these are available through the blueprint. Other ones are just some blogs that we pulled some information from. So thank you to the blog holders who had this information there, and full credit goes to them. Again, I'm going to make these slides available on my blog so that if you want to download them and click on the links, if not, pause the YouTube and check them out.
And also, I want to highlight for folks to not write off. If you actually look at some of the resources we leveraged and I still use today, the VCAP5 to VCAP6 resources are still, especially for like this section, are still extremely relevant. Don't write off a blog post just because you think it's on an older version of the technology, because in some of these more, conceptual and logical sections of the VCAP exam, not much has actually changed. We're talking about more of a design methodology. So,
yeah, the design methodology isn't going to change, or probably will change very little. So that information will stay static. And this is a design methodology that's adopted, throughout the IT industry. I've sat in conferences from all the different vendors, IBM, Cisco guys that talk about this stuff. So this is a design methodology that's been hammered out for some time. So like Ron was saying, it's don't just throw it away because it's it's a VCAP5 stuff. Like the stuff around the design methodology and the conceptual and logical to a certain aspect, that's definitely going to stay the same, or it'll still be very relevant.
So Rebecca, did we have any questions pop up in chat or on the Twitterverse?
No, it's been quiet. So I'll turn it over. We have a couple of attendees here. So if you do have any questions, go ahead and send us a message. So how many times did you practice this?
I think
we showed each other our slides today at lunch.
Yeah, I was chatting with Ron when you guys were when Jason was speaking, and I was like, wow, you're just bouncing back and forth right off each other as if you had rehearsed it a lot.
Well, that makes me feel good for my public speaking experience.
No.
For sure, and I like when you have other people too, because it gives you reprieve and the other person catches things you miss and things of that nature, and it really kind of just eases the nerves when you're public speaking and stuff like that too. So I think it's good, and me and Ron have worked a lot together in the past, so it's been fun, and we don't have a problem kind of ending each other's sentences, so I think it worked out well.
Excellent. Well, still no questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end the recording. So if there's any final words you want to say before we end the recording, and then we can say all the bad words after.
I just want to say I'm available on Twitter, VCDX directory. Feel free to reach out. I'm flagged as a mentor, but obviously I'm a father with 3 kids, so my time is limited, but I always try to at least provide at least some level of engagement and advice for those attempting the VCDX journey. It took me 3 defenses, as Jason Starr said at the beginning. I had the honor of defending right before him and did such a bad did so poorly that obviously he came in and looked like an awesome rock star and got his number.
I take full credit to Ron for me passing it.
But to kind of piggyback on your point, Ron, like I failed VCDX the first time, and I think I learned so much more from failing it than I probably would have learned if I passed it the first time. So for those of you who are listening, even if you go and fail a VCAP, like that's okay, right? So
it's how you pick yourself up. There's so much to be learned from when you fail in the VCAP. Or even if you go into VCDX and you get up to that panel and you put your all in there, and then you get that feedback and then in the ugly email, being able to take that feedback, for at least for myself, and understand the feedback and go, oh wow, I really am weak in this section, or I totally didn't even think about XYZ. And the amount of learning, like you said, Rebecca, in terms of you know, you gave a talk at the Sydney VMUG last week.
Yep.
You know, why failing VCDX made you a better architect, and I think that's extremely relevant with VCDX defenses. It's you go in front of a panel, and these are experts, and these are your peers, and you get kicked in the teeth, and you learn a lot about yourself, and you learn a lot about the technology and design qualities that you were weak in.
Yeah.
So by no means is a failure the end of the story, unless you want it to be, but it's really just a speed bump.
Yeah,
failure
is sometimes the best teacher. I have a story on my blog, and I still talk about it today. I don't think I would be in my career where I am today if I didn't fail the DCD the first time I took it, or the first 2 times I took it. You know, so I was very fortunate, and I did get past the VCDX. But the DCD caught me twice. And, you know, the whole reason why my career took the direction it did is because I reflected and I looked back and I said, well, you know, where did I go wrong? You know, I studied so hard, you know, and what I came to the conclusion of was I needed to better consolidate my study material. I needed to refocus on what the exam was looking for. And then I ended up building the content on virtualtours.net to help other people study and pass to get past the hurdles that I had. And then, you know, because of that, I got a tap on the shoulder from VMware and some other companies, and my career just went in a totally different direction than I never thought it would. And it all came from failure, right? So, like you guys said, failure isn't the end unless you want it to be. It's it's just temporary.
Yes. And we're not trying to be a bunch of downers here. So I think the moral of our story is reach out, right? Reach out if you have questions. You know, if you go take the VCAP and you fail, you'll get feedback on your score report that'll tell you what areas you're weak in. So reach out to us, you know, the 3 of us, or, you know, anybody else in the community. We're willing to help, right?
Yep, 100%.
It's a great thing about, I feel, you know, the VCAP and the VCDX communities is everyone is very ready to help. To that point, you know, I had a very local resource reach out to me via the VMUG and said, hey, I failed my DCD, can you help me out? And, you know, just a quick lunch, went over his feedback and kind of highlighted some areas and weak spots. And that's what this community does. We try to help everybody, you know, kind of translate some of the blueprint jargon into real world use cases.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I'm going to go ahead and end it. So thank you too for presenting, and thank everybody for listening in, and those who will be listening later on YouTube.
Perfect. No, thanks again for the opportunity. Always a pleasure. And yeah, best of luck, everybody.
Yep.